Kevin Costner, the enduring symbol of American cinema, was not born into fame. He was born into silence. In the dusty sprawl of Linwood, California, the youngest son of a ditch digger and a weary-eyed social worker, he learned early that survival was not a choice, but a rhythm. His father, Bill, came home each night with oil-stained hands and boots dusted in the color of labor. His mother, Sharon, carried the weight of other people's sorrow in her voice, yet still hummed softly as she stirred dinner on a stove that hissed more than it burned. Their home was small, their dreams modest, but love, fierce and unspoken, held the walls together. Yet beneath that warmth lingered a shadow. 2 years before Kevin was born, his brother Mark lived only a single day. That quiet loss reshaped the family in ways no one spoke aloud. His father grew stricter, his mother quieter, and Kevin grew up watching grief move through rooms like a breeze that never left. Sometimes he'd catch Sharon staring at an empty corner of the kitchen, her eyes filled with something unnameable. And perhaps it was there, in that wordless ache, that Kevin first learned what pain sounds like when it chooses silence over tears. He was not the loud one. He was the boy who wrote poems instead of answers, who packed his life into boxes as the family moved from town to town, chasing work, never catching peace. But through that ache, something unshakable took root, a belief that even if the world didn't see him, he could still build something that would last. And so began the quiet rise of a man who would one day teach the world how to dream. In 1978, Kevin Costner stood at the edge of a life that made sense and chose the one that didn't. Fresh out of Cal State Fullerton with a degree in marketing and finance, he had a steady job, a new wife, and a future that looked safe, but felt wrong. Every morning behind that desk, he felt the quiet suffocation of a dream deferred. Numbers didn't move him. Stories did. And one day, after a chance encounter with actor Richard Burton on a flight, a moment that felt more like prophecy than coincidence, Kevin came home and said, "I have to try." It wasn't rebellion. It was surrender. He quit his job, emptied their savings, and enrolled in acting classes. They moved into a tiny apartment in Los Angeles, where the walls were thin and the future thinner. He worked odd jobs, fishing boats, truck driving, carpentry, anything to keep the lights on while chasing auditions that rarely called back. Friends called him foolish. Family worried in silence, but Kevin kept going, not because he was certain, but because he couldn't live with not knowing. "I'd rather fail at something I love," he said, "than succeed at something that kills my spirit." And so began the long, uncertain climb, not to fame, but to faith. Faith in story, faith in struggle, faith that somewhere beyond the silence his voice would be heard. The road to becoming Kevin Costner was paved with rejection, silence, and the kind of hunger that doesn't just gnaw at your stomach, it gnaws at your soul. In the early 1980s, Los Angeles was a city of dreams, but for Kevin, it often felt like a city of locked doors. Casting agents barely looked up. Roles went to prettier faces, louder voices, safer bets. He was told he was too quiet, too introspective, too ordinary. But Kevin knew that ordinary men carried extraordinary stories. He took bit parts, background roles, anything that paid enough to keep the lights on. He was cut entirely from his first major film, The Big Chill. His scenes left on the editing room floor, his name absent from the credits. It was a blow that could have ended him, but instead it lit a fire. "I knew I had something to say," he recalled. "I just had to wait for the world to listen." He kept showing up, kept studying, kept believing. And slowly the tide began to turn. A role in Silverado gave him a sliver of spotlight. Then came No Way Out, and suddenly the quiet man from Linwood was no longer invisible. Hollywood had finally turned its head. But Kevin didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply went home, kissed his wife, and wrote another scene. Because he knew that fame was not the finish line. It was just another beginning, and he wasn't here to be famous. He was here to build something that would last. By the late 1980s, the quiet man Hollywood once overlooked had become its most compelling presence. Kevin Costner didn't explode onto the screen. He emerged like a slow-burning fire that refused to go out. Silverado gave him swagger. No Way Out gave him mystery. But it was the untouchables that gave him gravity. As Elliot Ness, he wasn't loud or flashy. He was steady, principled, the kind of man who held the line when others broke it. Audiences leaned in, drawn not to bravado but to integrity. Then came Bull Durham, and suddenly Kevin was more than a hero. He was human. Vulnerable, romantic, flawed. He made baseball feel like poetry, love feel like risk, and masculinity feel like grace. Directors began to see what casting agents had missed, that Costner didn't act from the outside in. He acted from the soul outward. His performances weren't performances. They were confessions, and with each role he built something rare, a reputation not just for talent but for truth. He wasn't chasing fame, he was chasing meaning. And when Field of Dreams arrived, it felt less like a movie and more like a prayer. A father's voice, a son's longing. A field where ghosts walked and hearts healed. Kevin Costner had become the quiet hero of American cinema, not because he shouted, but because he listened. Not because he dazzled, but because he endured. In 1990, Kevin Costner did something few actors dared. He bet everything on a story the industry didn't believe in. Dances with Wolves wasn't just a film. It was a vision. A quiet epic about language, land, and the dignity of native lives, told not with explosions, but with empathy. Studios balked, critics doubted. But Kevin believed. He directed it himself, financed it with his own money, and poured every ounce of his soul into the project. The shoot was brutal, months in the Dakota plains, battling weather, budget, and exhaustion. But what emerged was a masterpiece, a film that didn't just entertain, it healed. Dances with Wolves won 7 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director, and forever changed the way Hollywood approached indigenous stories. Kevin didn't just make history, he honored it. And in doing so, he proved that storytelling wasn't about spectacle, it was about soul. He became more than a star, he became a steward of truth. And though the applause was deafening, Kevin didn't bask in it. He returned home, kissed his children, and began writing again. Because for him, the goal was never glory. It was legacy. And with Dances with Wolves, he carved his name not into fame, but into film itself. After Dances with Wolves, Kevin Costner stood at the summit of Hollywood, a place few reach and fewer survive. The awards poured in, the offers multiplied, and the world called him a visionary. But triumph, like fame, carries its own weight. Kevin didn't chase blockbusters. He chased meaning. He chose roles that spoke to the soul: JFK, Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, The Bodyguard. Each film was a reflection of a man who believed in honor, in love, in the quiet strength of conviction. He wasn't the loudest voice in the room, but he was the one people listened to. Yet behind the camera flashes and red carpets, life grew more complicated. The pressure to stay on top, the strain of fame on family, the quiet unraveling of a marriage that had once steadied him. Kevin kept working, kept creating, but the storm had begun to gather. Critics turned. Projects faltered. And suddenly, the man who had redefined American cinema was being questioned by the very system he had elevated. But Kevin didn't flinch. He didn't chase approval. He returned to the one thing that had never betrayed him: story. He poured himself into Wyatt Earp, Waterworld, The Postman, films that didn't always win the box office but carried the heartbeat of a man who refused to compromise. "I don't make movies for critics," he said. "I make them for people who still believe." And in that belief, Kevin Costner remained unshaken. Not because he never fell, but because he never stopped standing back up. Behind the calm voice and steady gaze, Kevin Costner carried storms the cameras never caught. As his star rose, his home life began to fracture. The marriage that had anchored him through obscurity, his first love, Cindy, buckled under the weight of fame, absence, and the quiet erosion that success often brings. They had built a life together, raised 3 children, weathered years of uncertainty. But even love, when stretched too thin, can tear. Their divorce in 1994 was not loud, but it was devastating. Kevin buried himself in work, but the ache followed him from set to set. He smiled for cameras, signed autographs, gave interviews with grace. But at night, the silence in his home was louder than any applause. He tried to rebuild. New relationships, new children, new beginnings, but each came with its own cost. Courtroom battles, tabloid headlines, and the relentless scrutiny of a world that forgets its heroes are human. Kevin never lashed out, he never played the victim, he simply endured. "I've made mistakes," he admitted once, "but I've never stopped trying to be better." And that, perhaps, is the truest measure of a man, not how perfectly he walks, but how humbly he returns after falling. Through it all, Kevin remained what he had always been, a builder. Of stories, of families, of second chances. And though the spotlight could never warm the cold of an empty home, he kept the porch light on, hoping, always, that love might find its way back. Success had finally wrapped its arms around Kevin Costner, but it didn't feel like triumph. It felt like stillness. After Dances with Wolves, the world called him a genius, a visionary, a savior of the Western. But Kevin didn't feel saved. He felt exposed. The boy who had once whispered dreams into the dark was now standing in the brightest light, and all he could hear was the echo of his own doubt. "I didn't trust myself," he said, even as the Academy handed him gold. Because he knew what it had cost, the sleepless nights, the frozen trailers, the friendships strained, the quiet fear that maybe he had flown too close to something sacred, and yet he didn't stop. He couldn't. He followed Dances with a string of bold, uncompromising choices: Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, JFK, The Bodyguard. Each film a risk, each role a reflection of a man who refused to be boxed in. He played heroes not because they were perfect, but because they were human. Flawed, wounded, searching, just like him. And though the critics sometimes turned, the audience never did. They saw in Kevin what he had always carried: a quiet strength, a moral compass, a belief that stories could still mean something. He wasn't chasing hits. He was chasing truth. And even when the spotlight dimmed, he stood tall in the silence, because Kevin Costner had never been built for noise. He was built for endurance, for the long road, for the kind of legacy that doesn't burn fast, but burns forever. By the mid-1990s, Kevin Costner had become more than an actor. He was a symbol. Of American virtue, of cinematic integrity, of the quiet man who stood for something. But symbols are heavy, and the weight began to press. Every choice was scrutinized, every misstep magnified. Waterworld, once a daring vision, was mocked before it even premiered. The Postman, a story of hope in a broken world, was dismissed as vanity. Critics sharpened their knives. Headlines turned cruel. And Kevin, who had once been the embodiment of Hollywood's golden promise, found himself walking through a storm of doubt. But he didn't flinch. He didn't explain. He simply kept creating. Because for him, storytelling was never about applause, it was about truth. He knew that not every film would be loved, but every film would be honest. And in that honesty, he found peace. He returned to music, to directing, to the quiet corners of creativity where fame couldn't reach. He raised his children, built a ranch, and watched the sun rise over land that didn't ask him to perform. "I'm not here to be perfect," he said. "I'm here to be real." And in that realness, Kevin Costner endured, not as a flawless icon, but as a man who never stopped believing in the power of story. Even when the world turned its back, he kept walking. Because symbols fade, but truth walks forever. As the new millennium unfolded, Kevin Costner stepped back, not in retreat, but in reflection. The man who had once carried Hollywood on his shoulders now carried something quieter: wisdom. He returned to music, forming his band Modern West, not to chase charts, but to tell stories in another voice. He played small venues, sang about heartbreak and hope, and found peace in the rhythm of the road. On screen, he chose roles that mirrored his own evolution: mentors, fathers, men shaped by time. Open Range reminded audiences that the Western still had soul. Mr. Brooks revealed the shadows beneath the calm, and then came Hatfield's and McCoy's, a television epic that reignited his fire. Kevin didn't just act, he anchored. He reminded the world that legacy isn't built in youth. It's earned in endurance. And when Yellowstone arrived, it wasn't just a comeback. It was a coronation. As John Dutton, he became the patriarch of a new generation of storytelling: gritty, poetic, unapologetically American. The show didn't just revive his career. It revealed his essence. A man who had weathered storms, buried losses, and still stood tall. Not because he was untouched, but because he was unbroken. In the twilight of his life, Kevin Costner found new light, not in fame, but in faith. Faith in story, faith in silence. Faith that the boy from Linwood had built something that would outlive him. Away from the cameras, Kevin Costner is not a myth. He is a man of land, of silence, of slow mornings and long shadows. His ranch in Aspen stretches across thousands of acres, not as a symbol of wealth, but as a sanctuary of memory. He walks the fields at dawn, the same way his father once walked power lines, steady and alone. He builds fences with his own hands, not because he has to, but because he still believes in the dignity of labor. The land speaks to him in ways Hollywood never could. It doesn't ask for performance. It asks for presence. And in that presence, Kevin finds peace. He raises his children with the same quiet strength that once held his family together in Linwood. He teaches them not to chase fame, but to chase truth. He writes songs about heartbreak, about fathers and sons, about the kind of love that survives silence. And when he speaks of legacy, he doesn't mention awards or box office records. He talks about stories. About the ones that heal, the ones that endure, the ones that remind us who we are. Kevin Costner is no longer chasing the world. He is shaping it, one film, one song, one acre at a time, not as a star, but as a steward of land, of memory, of the quiet places where truth still lives. Kevin Costner has always understood that silence is not emptiness, it is sanctuary. As he grows older, he no longer seeks the roar of crowds or the rush of premieres. He seeks stillness. The quiet of early mornings on his ranch, the hush of snowfall on pine, the soft breath of horses grazing in the distance. He walks alone sometimes, not because he is lonely, but because solitude has become sacred. In that silence, he hears everything: his father's voice, his mother's humming, the echoes of roles that once carried him through storms. He writes more now, not for studios, but for himself. Letters to his children, lyrics that never need a stage, reflections that belong only to the wind. He knows that legacy is not built in noise, it is built in grace. In how you treat people when no one is watching, in the stories you leave behind for those who need them most. Kevin no longer needs to prove anything. He has already done what few ever do. He turned pain into poetry, silence into strength, and a fragile boy into a man who taught the world how to endure. And as the sun sets on another day, he stands beneath it not as a star, but as a witness. To a life lived fully. To a silence that still speaks. Kevin Costner no longer chases legacy. He lives it, not in statues or ceremonies, but in the quiet breath of stories that still move people. His films are taught in classrooms, quoted in living rooms, whispered in moments when courage is needed. Field of Dreams still makes fathers cry. Dances with Wolves still makes history feel human. Yellowstone still makes silence feel sacred. But Kevin doesn't measure his impact in applause. He measures it in echoes, in the way a line he once spoke becomes a lifeline for someone he'll never meet. In the way a character he once played helps a stranger believe in second chances. He walks through airports and hears, "You changed my life," and he nods, not with pride but with gratitude. Because he knows the truth, stories don't belong to the storyteller. They belong to the hearts they heal. And Kevin Costner has healed more than most. Not by being perfect, but by being present. By showing that strength can be quiet, that love can be flawed, and that endurance is its own kind of grace. His legacy breathes, not in the past, but in the present. In every person who still believes that one voice, one story, one man can make a difference. Mortality doesn't frighten Kevin Costner. It humbles him. He has seen too much, lost too much, endured too much to pretend that time is anything but sacred. At 70, he walks slower, listens longer, and speaks only when the words matter. He knows that legacy isn't built in youth. It's etched in the choices we make when no one's watching. He feels the weight of years not as burden, but as rhythm. The rhythm of a life that has danced with triumph and tragedy, with applause and silence. He visits his parents' graves not to mourn, but to remember, to thank them for the grit, the grace, the quiet love that shaped him. He watches his children grow, each one a chapter in the story he never stopped writing. And when he looks in the mirror, he doesn't see a star. He sees a survivor. A man who once whispered goodbye to towns that never knew him, and now whispers gratitude to a world that finally does. He knows the end will come, not with fanfare, but with quiet. And when it does, he hopes the stories will remain, not the headlines, not the fame, but the truth, that he lived with purpose, that he endured with grace, that he turned silence into legacy. Love for Kevin Costner was never a performance, it was a promise. And Cindy Silva was the first to believe in that promise. She saw the dreamer before the world did, held his hand through rejection, and whispered courage into the silence. Their love was built not on luxury, but on laughter, sacrifice, and the fragile hope that someday would come. And it did. But success, like fire, warms and burns. As Kevin's name lit up marquees, the distance between them grew, not in anger, but in absence. He missed birthdays, anniversaries, the quiet rituals that make a home feel whole. Cindy waited, smiled, forgave. But even belief has limits. By 1994, the marriage that had once steadied him unraveled, not in scandal, but in sorrow. Kevin wept, not for the headlines, but for the family photos that would never be taken. She was the wind beneath every beginning, he said, and in that sentence was every regret. He never blamed fame. He blamed the silence it left behind. And though they parted, her voice never left him. In interviews, in songs, in the way he still speaks of love as something sacred. Cindy was not a chapter. She was the prologue. The reason the story ever began, and in the quiet corners of his heart, she remains the girl who believed, the woman who waited, the love that fame forgot, but memory never will. At 70, Kevin Costner stands not in the shadow of his past, but in the light of what still remains. He is no longer the boy whispering dreams into the dark, nor the man chasing applause across red carpets. He is something rarer, a living testament to endurance. His life is not a straight line, but a constellation of risks, regrets, and revelations. He has known the warmth of love and the chill of its absence. He has held Oscars and court summons, newborns and scripts, guitars and grief. And yet, through every storm, he has never let go of the torch. The one lit in silence, carried through rejection, and passed from story to story like a sacred flame. That torch still burns, in the eyes of his children, in the lines of his characters, in the hearts of those who found themselves in his films. He has taught us that greatness is not loud. It is not perfect. It is not always recognized. Greatness is the man who keeps showing up, who builds when others doubt, who forgives when others forget, who turns silence into song and pain into poetry. Kevin Costner did not just act, he endured. He did not just entertain, he believed. And in doing so, he gave us more than movies. He gave us a map for how to begin again, how to stand tall, and how to walk through this world with grace, even when the lights go out. Fame had given Kevin Costner the world, but it had also taken pieces of his heart. Cindy waited through missed birthdays, through holidays blurred by jet lag, through the quiet ache of being second to a dream. She never raised her voice. She simply grew quieter. And Kevin, swept into the whirlwind of global stardom, didn't notice the silence until it was too loud to ignore. By 1994, the marriage that had once steadied him dissolved, not in scandal, but in sorrow. He wept privately, not for the headlines, but for the home that would never feel whole again. And though life moved forward, new relationships, new children, new beginnings, he carried the echo of that devotion like a scar beneath his smile. He never spoke ill of Cindy. He spoke of her with reverence as the woman who believed when no one else did, and in that reverence was every regret. He tried to rebuild, to be present, to be better. But the cost of greatness is often paid in the currency of intimacy. Kevin knew this. He didn't run from it. He simply kept walking, carrying the weight of love lost and the quiet hope that someday someone might see the man behind the myth and love him not for who he had become, but for who he had always been. If fame was the fire that forged him, fatherhood was the river that softened his edges. Kevin Costner, the man who once whispered dreams into the dark, became a father of 7, each child a different chapter, each one a mirror reflecting who he was, who he had been, and who he still hoped to become. With Annie, Lily, and Joe, he was the young dreamer, still climbing, still proving, still learning how to be present while chasing the horizon. With Liam, he was quieter, more reflective, trying to mend what had once been fractured. And with Caden, Hayes, and Grace, born in his later years, he became something else entirely, a man who no longer ran toward the world but stood still for it. He read bedtime stories with the same voice that once narrated epics. He taught them how to ride horses, how to listen to the wind, how to speak with kindness even when the world is loud. "I want them to know who I really am," he said, "not the actor, the man." And so he built a life not of premieres, but of presence. He showed up for school plays, for scraped knees, for quiet talks under starlit skies. He didn't try to be perfect. He tried to be there. And in doing so, he passed on the most enduring part of his legacy. Not the films, not the fame, but the lesson that love, when given fully and without condition, is the only role that never ends. Kevin Costner's life is not a straight line. It's a circle. A rhythm that returns again and again to the same truths: silence, endurance, and the power of story. Every role he's played echoes something deeper, something lived. Elliot Ness was the man who held the line. Crash Davis was the man who taught others how to dream. John Dutton is the man who protects what cannot be replaced. But beneath them all is Kevin, the boy who once whispered, "Just one more day in a cold apartment," the father who wept at the birth of his children, the artist who mortgaged his home for a film no one believed in. His stories are not fiction. They are fragments of a soul that refused to break. And now, as the world watches Horizon unfold, we see not just a film, but a full circle. A return to the land, to the silence, to the truth that began it all. Kevin Costner has never chased endings. He has chased meaning. And in doing so, he has become something rare, a man whose legacy is not confined to time, but carried forward in every person who still believes in the quiet power of perseverance. The credits may roll, but the story never ends. Because Kevin Costner didn't just live a life, he built a rhythm, and that rhythm still echoes. There will come a day when the lights dim, the cameras stop rolling, and Kevin Costner's name is spoken not in present tense, but in reverence. And when that day arrives, it won't be the box office numbers or the awards that define him. It will be the silence he carried, the truths he told, and the lives he touched. His legacy will not be housed in marble or gold, but in memory. In the father who watches Field of Dreams with his son and weeps, in the young actor who finds courage in The Postman, in the dreamer who sees Horizon and dares to believe again. Kevin Costner didn't just make films. He made meaning. He didn't just play heroes. He became one not by being flawless, but by being faithful. Faithful to story. Faithful to silence. Faithful to the long, hard road that few are willing to walk. And as the final frame fades, we will not say goodbye, we will say thank you for the endurance, for the grace, for the rhythm of a life that taught us how to rise, how to fall, and how to keep walking toward the light. Long after the final curtain falls, long after the last camera fades to black, Kevin Costner's story will remain, not as a tale of fame, but as a testament to faith. Faith in silence. Faith in struggle. Faith in the idea that one man, armed only with conviction and a battered Datsun, could change the rhythm of cinema forever. His journey was never about being the loudest voice in the room. It was about being the truest. He taught us that greatness is not measured in moments, but in the endurance between them. That love, when given fully, leaves echoes that never fade. That failure, when faced with grace, becomes a kind of wisdom. And that stories, real stories, don't end when the credits roll. They live on in the hearts they touch, in the lives they shape, in the quiet corners of memory where truth still whispers. Kevin Costner didn't just build a career. He built a compass, one that points not to stardom, but to soul. And as generations revisit his films, his music, his legacy, they won't just see a star. They'll see a man who kept showing up, who kept believing, who kept walking toward the light even when the world turned away. That is the story that outlives the star. That is the rhythm that never dies. For Kevin Costner, fatherhood was never a title, it was a vow. When Liam was born, it wasn't the headlines that mattered. It was the heartbeat, the tiny fingers, the second chance. Kevin didn't run from the truth. He met it with the same quiet resolve that had carried him through rejection, through fame, through the hollowing silence of loss. He didn't make speeches. He made promises to be present, to protect, to never let his son feel like a footnote in a life already written, and in doing so, he rewrote something within himself. Liam wasn't a complication. He was a compass. A reminder that love, when chosen freely and without condition, can heal what pride once broke. Kevin didn't flaunt this chapter. He lived it quietly: school pickups, shared birthdays, long walks through aspen snow. He didn't try to erase the past. He tried to grow from it. And in that growth, he found something rare, redemption without spectacle. He had once lost a family to the noise of ambition. Now he was learning to build one in the quiet. Not perfectly, not without missteps, but with intention, with conscience, with the kind of love that doesn't need cameras to be real. Because for Kevin Costner, legacy was never about being admired. It was about being accountable. And in the eyes of his son, he found the only approval that ever truly mattered. By the late 1990s, Kevin Costner had learned that love, like legacy, cannot be rushed. He moved through the world with caution, carrying the weight of past heartbreaks and the quiet ache of lessons earned in silence. Then, in 1998, he met Christine Baumgartner, a model, handbag designer, and woman of quiet strength. She was younger, yes, but not naive. She saw the man behind the myth, the father behind the fame, and the artist behind the armor. Their courtship was slow, deliberate, marked not by grand gestures but by long conversations, shared walks, and the kind of laughter that feels like home. Kevin hesitated. He had already lost too much to risk again. But Christine was patient. She didn't ask for promises. She asked for presence. And over time, Kevin began to believe that maybe, just maybe, love could return, not as a fire, but as a steady flame. They married in 2004 beneath the Colorado sky, surrounded by children, horses, and the kind of quiet joy that doesn't need headlines. Together, they built a life rooted in land, in family, in the rhythm of ordinary days. And though fame still knocked, Kevin answered with humility. Christine gave him not just companionship, but clarity. A reminder that trust, once broken, can be rebuilt, not by words, but by showing up. Every day, without fail. And in that showing up, Kevin Costner found something he had long searched for, not perfection, but peace. By the time Kevin Costner married Christine Baumgartner in 2004, he was no longer the man chasing the world. He was the man learning how to hold it gently. Together, they built a life not of spectacle, but of steadiness. In the quiet valleys of Colorado, far from the noise of premieres and paparazzi, they raised 3 children, Caden, Hayes, and Grace. Late fatherhood softened him in ways early fame never could. He was no longer the man who missed birthdays. He was the one braiding hair, coaching Little League, and rising before dawn to make pancakes before school. He brought the same devotion to fatherhood that he once gave to film, but now the applause came in laughter at the dinner table, in sleepy hugs, in the sacred silence of bedtime stories. He taught his children how to ride horses, how to respect the land, how to speak with kindness and stand with courage. "I want them to know who I really am," he said, not the actor, not the myth, but the man who had learned, through loss and love, what truly matters. And though the world still called, he answered it on his own terms. He turned down roles to be home for recitals. He built a life where legacy wasn't something to be chased. It was something to be lived, day by day, in the eyes of those who would carry his name forward. In Christine, he found not just a partner, but a peace he had once thought unreachable. And in his children, he found the rhythm of a life finally in tune. For nearly 2 decades, Kevin Costner and Christine Baumgartner built a life that felt like shelter, children, horses, quiet mornings, and the kind of love that grows not in spotlight, but in soil. But even the strongest roots can be shaken by time. In 2023, the storm returned. Christine filed for divorce after 18 years of marriage, citing irreconcilable differences. The headlines came swiftly, loud and merciless, as they always do when myth meets mortality. Kevin, now 68, didn't fight with fury. He responded with silence, dignity, and the same weary grace that had carried him through every fall before. The pain was real, another home divided, another rhythm broken. Custody arrangements, financial negotiations, the ache of seeing his youngest children caught in a story they never asked to be part of. He had once said, "You don't get used to heartbreak, you just learn how to walk with it." And walk he did, through courtrooms, through press cycles, through the quiet of an empty house. But this time he didn't drown in the loss. He turned toward creation. Horizon became more than a film, it became refuge. He poured everything into it, grief, hope, memory, and the stubborn belief that stories still matter. And in doing so, he reminded the world and himself that even when love fades, purpose remains. That even when the storm returns, the man who has weathered it before knows how to stand. Solitude, once a shadow, has become Kevin Costner's companion. Not bitter, not broken, just quieter. He walks the land now with a different rhythm, no longer chasing applause but listening for something deeper. The wind through the cottonwoods, the crunch of boots on frost, the echo of a life that has given and taken in equal measure. He rises early, not for call times, but for clarity. Horizon still burns in him, not just as a film, but as a philosophy. A belief that stories can still heal, that silence can still speak, that truth is worth the cost. He writes more now, not for studios, but for soul. Letters to his children, lyrics that may never be sung, reflections that belong only to the quiet. He is not waiting for the world to understand him. He is walking toward the part of it that already does. And in that walk there is grace. The kind that comes not from triumph, but from survival. Kevin Costner is no longer the man who needs to be seen. He is the man who sees. The land. The legacy. The love that remains, and as he moves through this final act, he carries no crown, only a torch, still burning, still guiding, still walking toward the horizon. Kevin Costner never wrote a manifesto. He didn't need to. His life became the code. A quiet creed etched in choices, not declarations. Show up. Tell the truth. Protect what matters. Whether on horseback in a windswept valley or behind a camera chasing a dream no one else could see, he lived by a rhythm older than fame, one of grit, grace, and groundedness. He believed in the land, in loyalty, in the kind of love that doesn't need to be loud to be lasting. He taught his children that character is built in silence, not spotlight. That legacy is not what you leave behind, but what you live through. He forgave without fanfare, endured without bitterness, and created without compromise. And though the world often measured him by box office and headlines, Kevin measured himself by something simpler. Did I keep my word? Did I honor the story? Did I rise when it would have been easier to retreat? That quiet code, unwritten, unspoken, but unmistakably lived, is the true inheritance he leaves behind. Not just for his children, but for every soul who ever found courage in his characters, comfort in his voice, or clarity in his silence. Kevin Costner didn't just act, he abided. And in that abiding, he became something more than a star. He became a compass. Kevin Costner's films do not age, they echo. Across decades, across generations, they continue to speak in voices that feel like memory. Field of Dreams still calls fathers and sons to the quiet magic of reconciliation. Dances with Wolves still reminds us that empathy can rewrite history. The Bodyguard still pulses with the ache of love that arrives too late. And Yellowstone, with its dust and defiance, still teaches that land is not property. It is inheritance. These stories are not just entertainment. They are emotional architecture. People build their lives around them, quote them in eulogies, revisit them in moments of doubt. Kevin never chased trends. He chased truth. And that truth, once captured on film, refuses to fade. His characters are not perfect, they are persistent. They endure heartbreak, loss, injustice, and still rise, just like him. And so the cinematic echo continues, in classrooms, in living rooms, in the quiet spaces where someone presses play not for distraction, but for direction. Kevin Costner's legacy is not confined to the screen. It lives in the hearts of those who found themselves in his stories. And as long as people seek courage, seek connection, seek the kind of silence that speaks louder than sound, his films will remain. Not as relics, but as rhythm. Some endings do not explode, they erode. And for Kevin Costner, the dissolution of his second marriage was not a collapse. It was a slow unraveling of a life he had built with trembling hope. The ranch that once echoed with laughter now held silence like a second skin. The room still bore the scent of Christine's perfume, the ghosts of bedtime stories, the fading warmth of a family that had once felt eternal. He didn't rage, he didn't retaliate, he simply grieved. Quietly, the man who had once stood beneath Oscar lights now stood beneath courtroom ceilings, dividing not just assets but memories. And when the headlines screamed numbers, he thought only of the smallest things, Grace's drawings on the fridge, Hayes's muddy boots by the door, Caden's voice calling Dad from the hallway. He had built this world with love and now watched it fracture with formality. The betrayal, if it was one, came not from scandal but from the ache of being replaced. A friend walking beside the woman he still loved. A photograph that felt like a wound. Kevin didn't speak publicly. He let the silence speak for him. "Some things you can't unsee," he whispered. And yet, even in heartbreak, he chose grace. He showed up for his children. He honored the years. He let the pain shape him, not harden him. Because Kevin Costner has always known that the truest measure of a man is not how he loves when life is easy, but how he endures when it's not. After the storm, Kevin Costner did not seek revenge. He sought stillness. The kind that doesn't come from isolation, but from clarity. He returned to the ranch not as a husband, but as a father, a craftsman, a man rebuilding once more. The laughter was quieter now, the dinners smaller, but the love remained fractured perhaps, but not gone. He poured himself into Horizon, not as an escape, but as a reckoning. Every frame a meditation, every line a prayer. He walked the Utah desert with dust on his boots and purpose in his bones, chasing not perfection, but peace. The cameras rolled, but he no longer needed them. What mattered was the story, the legacy, the promise to his children that even when the world divides, creation can still unite. He spoke less in interviews, smiled less for cameras, but behind the silence was a man who had learned the rarest art of all, how to lose without bitterness, how to love without possession, how to live without applause. Kevin Costner, now in the twilight of fame, stands not as a star, but as a steward. Of land. Of story. Of the quiet truths that outlast the noise, and in that stillness he has found something more enduring than success. He has found grace. By early 2024, the marriage was over, the court had spoken, and the headlines moved on. But Kevin Costner did not. He carried the ache like a stone in his pocket, small, constant, and shaped by time. He did not speak ill of Christine. He never would. She had been his partner, his peace, the mother of 3 children who still ran through his dreams. What they built was real. What they lost was realer. And yet, even in the wreckage, he chose grace. He showed up to school events, smiled for photos, and stood beside the woman who had once walked him into the light. Not for her, not for the world, but for the children who still needed to believe in something whole. He knew the cost of absence. He had lived it. He would not let them inherit that silence. And so he rose again, not as a husband, but as a father, a filmmaker, a man who still believed in the power of showing up. Horizon moved forward not as a monument to ego, but as a gift, a legacy carved from dust and devotion. Kevin no longer needed to be understood, he only needed to be true, and in that truth he found something unshakable. Not the applause, not the love that left, but the light that remains. The light of a man who has lost, endured, and still chooses to build, not for the world, but for the ones who carry his name. The ache remained, but so did the fire. Kevin Costner, now in his 70s, stood once more at the edge of a dream, weathered, wiser, and still reaching. Horizon was no longer just a film. It was a mirror. A reflection of every mile he had walked, every silence he had survived, every truth he had refused to abandon. He poured into it not just money, but memory. Not just ambition, but apology. It was the story of a nation, yes, but also the story of a man who had learned that legacy is not built in moments of triumph, but in the quiet persistence of belief. On set, he was still the first to arrive, boots dusted, eyes steady. He rewrote scenes between takes, whispered encouragement to younger actors, and stood behind the camera like a man guarding something sacred. Horizon was not for the critics. It was for his children, for the ones who would one day ask, "What did Dad believe in?" And he wanted the answer to be clear, in truth, in endurance, in the kind of love that builds even after it breaks. The horizon ahead was not fame, it was faith. That stories still matter. That silence still speaks. That even now, after all he's lost, Kevin Costner still walks toward the light, not because it's easy, but because it's right. Kevin Costner has never been just a man of moments. He is a man of meaning. And now, as the dust settles from another heartbreak, another chapter closed, he turns not inward but forward. His legacy is no longer just in the films that shaped generations, but in the quiet choices that shaped his children. In the way he shows up, even when it hurts. In the way he protects what cannot be replaced. Horizon continues, not as a monument to what he's lost, but as a gift to what remains. He writes not for fame, but for memory. He builds not for applause, but for inheritance. And in every frame, every line, every quiet sunrise on set, he leaves behind a map for how to endure, how to rebuild, how to love without possession. His children carry that map now, not in their pockets, but in their bones. They know the sound of his voice, the weight of his silence, the truth of his eyes. And long after the cameras fade, long after the headlines forget, they will remember. Not the star, not the scandal, but the man who kept walking, who kept believing, who kept building a legacy not of perfection, but of presence. Kevin Costner's story does not end. It lives in the land, in the light, and in the hearts of those who still believe in the quiet power of truth. Some men leave behind films. Kevin Costner leaves behind folklore. Not the kind etched in marble or gilded in gold, but the kind passed from voice to voice, father to son, dreamer to dreamer. He has become more than a name in credits. He is a symbol of grit without cruelty, of fame without arrogance, of masculinity tempered by tenderness. His story is told not just on screens, but around campfires, in classrooms, in quiet moments when someone dares to believe again. He is the man who built a baseball field in a cornfield and made us believe our fathers might still be listening. The man who danced with wolves and reminded us that empathy is a kind of courage. The man who stood in courtrooms, on ranches, in deserts, always choosing truth over ease. And now, as the years stretch behind him like a trail of dust and light, Kevin Costner becomes something rarer than a star. He becomes a myth that breathes. A legend not of perfection, but of persistence. His rhythm echoes in the land he loves, in the stories he told, in the silence he honored. And long after the lights fade, long after the last frame flickers, people will still speak his name, not for what he had, but for what he held sacred. Story, family, grace, and the unshakable belief that the horizon is always worth walking toward. And so the story slows, not to an end, but to a breath. Kevin Costner walks now not toward applause, but toward horizon, where the land meets the sky and silence holds more truth than sound. He has loved, lost, built, broken, and rebuilt again, not perfectly, not painlessly, but with a kind of grace that only time can teach. His films remain, yes, but more than that, his rhythm remains, in the way he showed up, in the way he endured, in the way he taught us that legacy is not what you leave behind, but what you live through. He is no longer chasing the world. He is guiding it, quietly, through story, through silence, through the steady beat of a heart that never stopped believing. And when the final credits roll, when the last light fades, we will not remember him for the roles he played. We will remember him for the truth he carried, the dust on his boots, the ache in his voice, the love that outlived the loss. Kevin Costner did not just make movies, he made meaning. And in that meaning, he gave us something sacred, a compass, a rhythm, a reason to keep walking, toward the light, toward the land, toward the horizon. Even as the years stretch long and the spotlight dims, Kevin Costner's rhythm continues to echo, not in theaters alone, but in the quiet corners of life where story still matters. His legacy is not confined to the screen or the ranch or the courtroom. It lives in the way people speak of him, in reverent tones, in remembered lines, in the hush that follows his name. He is the actor who made silence cinematic, the father who chose presence over perfection, the man who kept building even when the world kept breaking. And now, as Horizon unfolds, not just as a film but as a philosophy, Kevin becomes something more than a storyteller. He becomes a steward of memory, a keeper of rhythm, a witness to the truth that lives between the lines. His children carry that rhythm now, in their laughter, in their questions, in the way they look at the land and see something sacred. And generations to come will feel it too, in the stories he told, in the choices he made, in the quiet grace of a man who never stopped walking toward the light. Kevin Costner's rhythm is not just remembered. It is inherited. It is lived. It is the echo that reminds us all greatness is not in being seen. It is in seeing, and in choosing again and again to walk with grace. Kevin Costner didn't see Whitney Houston as a risk. He saw her as a revelation. When others doubted, he believed. When executives hesitated, he insisted. "She's the one," he told them. "She doesn't need to act. She needs to be." And so began one of the most unexpected and unforgettable pairings in cinematic history. On set, he protected her, not just as a co-star, but as a friend. He adjusted lighting to flatter her features, rewrote scenes to honor her voice, and stood beside her when the pressure threatened to crush her. The chemistry between them wasn't scripted. It was sacred. Two souls, both weary from fame, finding refuge in each other's quiet. After The Bodyguard, they remained close, not romantically, but spiritually. Kevin saw the fragility behind the power, the ache behind the voice. And when the world lost her in 2012, he didn't speak for headlines. He spoke for her. At her funeral, he stood before a grieving world and told the truth that Whitney was not perfect, but she was real, that she had given everything and that sometimes the world takes too much. His voice cracked, his hands trembled, but his promise held. "I will always love you," he said, not as a lyric, but as a vow. And in that moment, the bodyguard became the mourner. The man who had once shielded her from danger now shielded her memory from distortion. Kevin Costner didn't just make a film with Whitney Houston, he made a promise. And even in her absence, he kept it, with silence, with grace, with the kind of love that never needed to be loud to be lasting. Kevin Costner didn't just cast Whitney Houston, he shielded her. When executives doubted her readiness, when whispers questioned the optics, he stood firm. "She's the one," he said, not as a gamble, but as a conviction. On set, he adjusted the lighting to honor her skin tone, rewrote scenes to protect her dignity, and held space for her fear without judgment. He knew the weight she carried, the pressure to be flawless, the fear of failing in a world that rarely forgave black women for being human. And so he became more than a co-star. He became a guardian of her light. Their chemistry was not rehearsed. It was recognition. Two people who understood the loneliness of being adored. When The Bodyguard soared, it wasn't just a box office triumph. It was a cultural shift. A love story that crossed boundaries, not with noise, but with grace. And when Whitney's voice began to falter in the years that followed, Kevin never turned away. He never spoke against her. He only remembered her as she was in that first audition, nervous, luminous, extraordinary. When she died, he eulogized her not as a fallen star, but as a friend who had once trusted him with her fear. "You weren't just pretty," he said. "You were the greatest singer of your generation." And in that moment, the world saw what she had always been to him, not a headline, but a human being. Kevin Costner didn't just protect her on screen. He protected her legacy. And in doing so, he reminded us that the truest love stories are not always romantic. Sometimes they are simply kind. Kevin Costner knew what Whitney Houston carried long before the world saw her fall. He had seen it in her eyes during their first table read, the weight of expectation, the fear of imperfection, the ache of being adored but not always understood. On set, he became her anchor, not with grand gestures but with quiet steadiness. He shielded her from the noise, rewrote scenes to protect her dignity, and reminded her that she didn't have to be flawless to be unforgettable. Their friendship was never loud, never tabloid-bound. It was built in the spaces between takes, in the silences that only two weary souls could share. After The Bodyguard, they drifted apart as life demanded, but the bond remained. Kevin watched from afar as Whitney's voice, once celestial, began to tremble. He never judged, he never abandoned. And when the world lost her, he stepped forward, not as a celebrity, but as a friend. At her funeral, his voice cracked, his hands trembled, but his words held. He spoke of her courage, her vulnerability, her light. "She was scared," he said, "but she trusted me." And in that trust, he found a kind of grace that fame could never offer. Kevin Costner didn't just mourn Whitney Houston, he honored her. Not with spectacle, but with sincerity. And in doing so, he reminded the world that the most sacred friendships are not measured by time or proximity, but by the quiet promise to protect someone's truth, even when they're no longer here to speak it. Kevin Costner never chased controversy, but he never fled from truth. When he cast Whitney Houston in The Bodyguard, he didn't just defy studio pressure. He rewrote the rules of what Hollywood dared to believe. He saw her not as a risk, but as a revelation. And when the world lost her, he didn't mourn with spectacle. He mourned with grace. His eulogy was not a performance, it was a reckoning. A reminder that fame is fragile and that behind every icon is a human being longing to be seen without expectation. "She was scared," he said, voice trembling, "but she trusted me." That trust became sacred. It shaped him. In the years that followed, Kevin's films grew quieter, deeper. Fathers and daughters, loss and redemption, the ache of love that arrives too late. He no longer needed to prove anything. He had already stood in the fire and chosen kindness. And in that choice, he became something more than a leading man. He became a witness to fragility, to grace, to the kind of love that doesn't need to be loud to be lasting. Whitney's voice may have faded, but her echo lives in him, in the way he protects memory, in the way he honors silence, in the way he still walks toward the horizon carrying the weight of every promise he kept. In the years after Whitney Houston's passing, Kevin Costner's work grew quieter, more reflective. The man who once played legends now told stories of loss, of fathers trying to reach their children, of men haunted by choices and softened by time. Fame no longer thrilled him, it humbled him. He had seen what it could give and what it could take. Whitney's death was not just a tragedy, it was a turning point. A reminder that behind every spotlight is a soul, and behind every soul is a silence no audience can fill. Kevin carried that silence into his films, into his writing, into the way he showed up for others. He became gentler with his castmates, more patient with his crew, more present with his children. He spoke less in interviews, but when he did, his words carried weight. "We're all just trying to be okay," he said once, "even the ones who look like they already are." That compassion became his compass. It shaped Horizon, not as a Western, but as a meditation on endurance. It shaped his parenting, not as performance, but as presence. And it shaped his legacy, not as a man who conquered Hollywood, but as one who learned how to hold its fragility with grace. Kevin Costner didn't just survive fame, he softened it. And in doing so, he gave the world something far rarer than a blockbuster. He gave it a blueprint for how to love, how to lose, and how to keep walking toward the light. Horizon was never just a film. It was a reckoning. A frontier not of land, but of soul. As Kevin Costner stood behind the camera, directing scenes of dust, conflict, and quiet courage, he was also directing the story of his own becoming. The man who had once chased roles now chased meaning. Horizon became the canvas for everything he could no longer say aloud: the grief of losing his parents, the ache of divorce, the fragile hope of fatherhood, the silence left by Whitney's absence. Each shot was a prayer, each line a confession. He poured into it not just artistry, but apology. For the years he missed, for the voices he couldn't save, for the homes he tried to hold together. And as the sun set over the Utah desert, casting long shadows across the set, Kevin stood still, dust on his boots, script in hand, heart open. Horizon was not his farewell, it was his offering, a story for his children, a rhythm for those who still believe in grace. And in that offering, he found something he had long searched for, not redemption, but reflection. The frontier was never out there. It was always within. And Kevin Costner, after a lifetime of building worlds, had finally built one that told the truth. Kevin Costner once played heroes with broad shoulders and booming voices. But in the twilight of his career, he began to write them differently, quieter, flawed, human. Horizon became the culmination of that shift, a story not of conquest, but of consequence. The characters he shaped were no longer invincible. They were tired fathers, grieving mothers, wanderers who carried more memory than map. And in each of them, there was a piece of Kevin himself. The man who had lost parents too soon. The man who had watched love slip through courtroom doors. The man who had stood beside a trembling singer and promised protection. He no longer needed to be the hero. He had become the architect of them, and in that humility his storytelling deepened. Horizon was not just a Western, it was a reckoning. A meditation on what it means to build something that might outlive you. He wrote with the weight of experience, directed with the patience of grief, and filmed with the reverence of a man who knows that every frame is a farewell. Kevin Costner's heroes now bleed, falter, forgive. And in doing so, they teach us that strength is not in the absence of pain, but in the choice to keep walking through it. He no longer plays the myth. He writes the truth. And in that truth, he leaves behind something far more enduring than legend. He leaves behind light. Horizon was never just a western. It was a return. To land. To silence. To the truths that don't need dialogue to be felt. Kevin Costner shaped it not as spectacle, but as scripture. Each frame a meditation on belonging, each character a reflection of the people he's loved and lost. The frontier he filmed was vast, but the frontier he explored was internal. The ache of fatherhood, the weight of legacy. The quiet grief of promises kept too late. He walked the set like a man revisiting memory, not myth. The dust reminded him of his father's boots. The wind carried echoes of his mother's voice. And the horizon itself, endless, golden, unforgiving, became a mirror for the life he had lived. He didn't direct with ego, he directed with reverence. For the land. For the story. For the children who would one day ask what it all meant. Horizon became his answer. A film not about conquest, but about consequence. Not about heroes, but about humanity. And in every shot, every silence, every sunset, Kevin Costner left behind something sacred. A map. A rhythm. A reminder that the land listens. And if you're quiet enough, it will tell you who you are. Pain, he said once, isn't my enemy, it's the receipt. The quiet invoice for a life lived without shortcuts. Kevin Costner never asked for ease, he asked for truth. And truth, as he learned, demands a toll. Every role carved something from him, skin, bone, silence. The cowboy who limped off set, the bodyguard who carried more than a woman through the rain, the father who missed final breaths while chasing dreams built for them. At 70, the body that once outran explosions now moves slower but with more meaning. His knees whisper reminders. His back hums with memory. His hands tremble not from weakness but from the weight of all they've held. He does not resent the wear. He reveres it, because every ache is a story, every scar a signature, and every breath still taken is a vow to keep going. He no longer fights for fame. He fights for legacy. For the children who watch him rise each morning despite the pain. For the stories that still ask to be told. For the promise he made to his parents, to Whitney, to himself, that he would never stop walking toward the light. Kevin Costner's devotion is not measured in awards or headlines. It is measured in endurance, in the quiet courage to keep showing up, and in the grace to call pain not punishment but proof. Pain, he said once, isn't my enemy. It's the proof I showed up, and show up he did, through broken ribs, burning sun, and the slow betrayal of time. Kevin Costner never asked for shortcuts. He asked for meaning. And meaning, he learned, demands a body willing to bear the cost. At 70, the man who once ran through fire now walks with a measured grace. The knees creak, the hands tremble, but the spirit, unbowed, still rises before dawn. He straps on the boots, steps onto set, and becomes again what he has always been, a builder of stories, of silence, of legacy. He no longer needs to prove he can carry the weight. He has already carried it, through grief, through divorce, through the long ache of absence. What he carries now is different, gentler. He carries the memory of his parents, the echo of Whitney's voice, the laughter of his children, the dust of every road he's walked. And in that weight there is no bitterness, only reverence. Because Kevin Costner understands what few ever do, that the body may falter but the will can still blaze. That the truest strength is not in the gallop but in the stride that never stops. And so he keeps walking, toward the horizon, toward the stories still waiting, toward the light that never left him. Not because it's easy, but because it's right. Kevin Costner's body may ache, but his spirit remains unbroken. The man who once galloped across screens now walks with quiet purpose, each step a testament to the stories he's lived and the truths he's earned. He no longer chases youth. He honors age, because age, he's learned, is not a decline, it's a deepening. A softening of ego, a sharpening of soul. The pain in his joints, the tremble in his hands, the long hours wrapped in ice and silence, they are not burdens, they are brushstrokes, and together they form a masterpiece of endurance. Horizon is not just a film, it is the canvas where every scar finds its place, every loss finds its echo. Every breath becomes a vow. Kevin no longer needs to be the hero. He has become the witness, to love, to grief. to the quiet resilience that outlasts applause, and in that witnessing he offers something sacred, not just a legacy of cinema but a legacy of character, of showing up, of staying true, of walking forward even when the road disappears. His masterpiece is not in the roles he played, but in the life he refused to abandon. And as the horizon stretches before him, golden and vast, Kevin Costner walks on, not because he must, but because he still can. Kevin Costner's legacy no longer lives only in the films he made, it lives in the lives he shaped. His children, 7 in all, carry pieces of him not just in their names, but in their rhythm. Caden, Hayes, Grace, Liam, Joe, Lily, Annie, they are the quiet inheritors of a man who gave everything to be present, even when the world pulled him away. He taught them not with lectures, but with example. That love is a promise kept in silence. That pain is not weakness, but proof of devotion. That showing up, even tired, even broken, is the truest kind of strength. Horizon, the film he built from dust and sacrifice, is not just for audiences, it is for them. A story carved from the land, stitched with memory and offered as a map for how to endure. Kevin no longer seeks immortality through fame, he seeks it through inheritance. Through bedtime stories told in his voice, through lessons whispered on horseback, through the quiet understanding that legacy is not what you leave behind, it's what you pass on breath by breath, mile by mile. And in the eyes of his children, he sees the horizon he was always walking toward, not the one on screen. The one that lives in love. Kevin Costner's legacy no longer belongs to him alone. It belongs to the storytellers who follow. To the young director watching Dances with Wolves for the first time, feeling the pulse of a land that speaks without words. To the actor studying The Bodyguard, learning that protection is not bravado, it's presence. To the writer tracing the arc of Horizon, discovering that the frontier is not a place but a reckoning. Kevin's rhythm, steady, soulful, unshaken, has become a blueprint, not for fame but for truth. He taught that silence can be cinematic, that grief can be graceful, that love, when real, does not need to be loud to be lasting. And now, as his steps slow and his voice deepens, others begin to walk in his rhythm. Not to imitate, but to honor. His legacy is not a monument, it is a movement. A quiet call to tell stories that matter, to protect beauty, to endure pain, to walk toward the horizon even when the light fades. Kevin Costner did not just leave behind films, he left behind a way of being. And in that way, the next generation finds not just inspiration, but inheritance. And so the story returns to silence, not as an ending, but as a benediction. Kevin Costner, the man who once ran through fire, now walks through memory. He has built worlds, carried legends, buried grief, and raised children beneath skies that remember everything. His legacy is not in the box office, but in the quiet moments that never made the headlines. The whispered encouragement to Whitney, the trembling hands at his mother's funeral, the steady presence at school plays and birthdays. He has loved imperfectly, endured faithfully, and created with a reverence that defies time. Horizon stands now not as a monument, but as a mirror. A reflection of the man who dared to believe that story could heal, that silence could speak, that love, when real, could outlast even the cruelest winds. And as the final light fades across the desert he filmed, Kevin Costner remains. Not as a star, but as a rhythm, a father, a witness, a keeper of grace. The applause may quiet, the cameras may dim, but the light he carried never leaves. It lives in the stories, in the silence, in the eyes of those who still believe. And somewhere beneath a wide sky, a man walks toward the horizon, not to be seen, but to keep seeing. It's my reminder that I'm still alive doing what I love. He moves slower now, but there is purpose in every motion. He wakes before dawn, the same way he did 40 years ago, stepping out into the chill of the Colorado air as the first light spills across the hills. At the Dunnar Ranch, he walks the same paths he once walked with his children, the past alive in the frost underfoot. Sometimes he feeds the horses himself, their breath steaming in the cold. His back protests, his knees argue, but he keeps moving. Movement, he says, is what keeps me alive. The body may falter, but the heart, that old engine, still burns hot. Even now, as Horizon demands long days under brutal sun, he refuses to yield to comfort. Crew members say he works harder than men half his age. He directs, acts, edits, negotiates, all while managing the tremors of time that run quietly through his frame. During breaks, he sits in silence, eyes fixed on the land, the horizon stretching like a promise he still believes in. "You can't fake the truth of a man's eyes," he once said, and his still shine, weary but unbroken. Time has taken its share. The strength of youth, the quick recovery, the illusion of invincibility. What it has left is rarer. Grace. The grace of knowing limits and still choosing to move beyond them. The grace of turning pain into prayer. There are days when the ache lingers too long, when his back stiffens, and the memories of Waterworld and hidden figures return like old ghosts. But he does not complain. He takes the pain, folds it gently into his work, and lets it become part of the story. For millions watching from afar, fans now older, grayer, slower, there is something sacred in seeing him still rise, still ride, still believe. He has become a mirror for everyone who wakes up stiff and tired and chooses to keep going anyway. His body may carry the ruin of years, but his presence carries their redemption. In that, he has become more than an actor. He is a testament to endurance itself. There is a quiet scene that those close to him describe. Late evening in Aspen, the sky burning gold. Kevin standing by the fence, watching the horses graze. His hands rest on the rail, the veins sharp, the lines deep. He breathes in slowly as if memorizing the light. Behind him, a life of storms before him. Another horizon still waiting. He knows the body won't last forever. None do. But the stories, the faith, the love, the grit, those will. "Maybe I've slowed down," he once said with a small smile, "but I haven't stopped." And that is Kevin Costner's final masterpiece. Not the films, not the fame, but the refusal to surrender to time. He stands for everyone who has grown old but not empty. For everyone whose body has betrayed them, but whose heart still knows how to fight. He is proof that even when strength fades, meaning can still blaze, that every wrinkle, every scar, every ache is just life's way of saying, "You're still here. Keep riding." Now, at 70, Kevin Costner stands as living proof that no dream ever truly fades. It simply takes a different shape. He was born in a modest home in Linwood, California, the son of a ditch digger and a social worker, and now gazes across empires he built with his own hands. His net worth, exceeding $250 million, is not a monument to greed, but a testament to endurance. A boy who once moved from town to town, sleeping beside packed boxes, now owns landscapes that look like America itself. Vast, untamed, magnificent. His Dunnar Ranch in Aspen, Colorado, is the kind of place people only imagine in dreams. 160 acres of mountain solitude where the air hums with pine and prayer. Valued at nearly $250 million, it isn't just a home, but a living monument to persistence. There are 3 distinct residences. A main lodge of timber and glass where sunrise floods every room like grace, a lakeside house built for quiet mornings of reflection, and a river house where the sound of flowing water feels like a heartbeat. Across the property, there's a private baseball field where his children once played under the Colorado sun, a skating rink, and trails carved through whispering forests. On winter nights, the snow catches the light of the fireplaces and turns the entire valley gold. It is beauty without arrogance, luxury woven with memory. Further west on the golden bluffs of Santa Barbara stands his Flint Ridge estate, a Tuscan masterpiece valued at nearly $60 million overlooking the Pacific. Kevin Costner's story does not end. It settles. Like dusk over the Rockies, like the final chord of a song that still echoes long after the music fades. He has lived not for perfection, but for presence. Not for applause, but for authenticity. And in doing so, he has become more than a star. He has become a steward of grace. The boy from Linwood who once slept beside cardboard boxes now walks among empires built from faith, grit, and love. His ranches hum with memory. His children carry his rhythm. His films whisper truths that outlast time. He has known pain, betrayal, triumph, and silence. And through it all, he kept moving. Not because he was unbroken, but because he believed in what could still be built. Kevin Costner stands now as a parable for every soul who has endured. A reminder that legacy is not what we leave behind, it is what we live through. And as the final light spills across the land he loves, he does not ask for statues or songs. Only this, that we keep telling stories, that we keep walking toward the horizon, that we remember him not for the roles he played, but for the truth he carried. And so we do, with reverence, with gratitude, with the quiet understanding that some lives are not just lived, they are lit, and Kevin Costner's was one of them.